Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The gym in General Santos City held an unusual silence that evening, broken only by the rhythmic sound of a heavy bag swaying gently from side to side. Manny Pacquiao stood motionless in the center of the training ring, his gloved hands resting on the ropes as he stared at the empty seats that once witnessed countless hours of preparation for the greatest fights of his career. The familiar scent of leather and sweat filled the air, but something felt different tonight, something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. His phone had been buzzing intermittently for the past hour, each vibration sending a small jolt through his pocket. Manny knew who was calling without even looking at the screen. The ringtone was one he had set specifically for his longtime trainer and friend, Freddie Roach, the man who had shaped not just his fighting technique, but had been there through every triumph and defeat of his legendary career. The relationship between Manny and Freddie had always been more than just trainer and fighter. It was built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and countless hours spent perfecting combinations that would eventually make boxing history. Freddie had been the architect of Manny's most memorable victories, the steady voice in his corner during the most challenging moments, and the first person to believe that a skinny kid from the Philippines could conquer the world. But lately, things had been different. Manny had noticed the subtle changes in Freddie's demeanor during their recent training sessions. The trademark intensity was still there, but it was accompanied by something else, a weariness that seemed to weigh heavily on the veteran trainer's shoulders. Freddie's movements had become more deliberate, his instructions more measured, and there were moments when Manny caught him staring into the distance with an expression that spoke of battles fought beyond the confines of any boxing ring. The phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. Manny slowly removed his gloves, the leather making a soft thud as they hit the canvas floor. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the device, not from physical exertion, but from an inexplicable sense that this call would be different from all the others. The screen showed Freddie's name, but when Manny finally answered, the voice on the other end was barely recognizable. What he heard in those first few seconds made him sink onto the stool in his corner. It wasn't just the shakiness in Freddie's voice that caught him off guard. It was the raw vulnerability, the complete absence of the confident, commanding tone that had guided him through over a decade of professional boxing. This was a man who had trained multiple world champions, who had faced the pressures of the biggest stages in boxing, but now sounded like someone who had reached the absolute limit of his emotional endurance. Manny closed his eyes and listened, his own breathing becoming shallow as he tried to process what he was hearing. The words coming through the phone painted a picture of exhaustion that went far beyond physical fatigue. It was the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into a person's soul after years of carrying burdens that others couldn't see or understand. The evening light filtering through the gym windows began to fade, casting long shadows across the training equipment. Manny remained seated in that corner, holding the phone with both hands, knowing that whatever Freddie was about to tell him would change everything between them. The silence in the gym suddenly felt prophetic, as if the walls themselves were preparing to witness a conversation that would reveal truths neither man had been ready to face until this moment. The words that came through the phone that night would remain etched in Manny's memory forever. Freddie's voice carried a weight that seemed to press against Manny's chest, each sentence revealing layers of struggle that had been carefully hidden beneath years of professional composure. The trainer who had always been his anchor, his source of tactical brilliance and unwavering confidence, was now sharing the burden of a battle that had nothing to do with boxing gloves or championship belts. Manny found himself walking slowly around the empty gym as he listened, his bare feet making soft sounds against the worn canvas floor. The familiar surroundings that had always brought him comfort now felt different, as if he were seeing them through new eyes. Every piece of equipment told a story of their partnership. The heavy bag where Freddie had taught him to channel his power more effectively, the speed bag that had helped refine his hand-eye coordination, the ring where countless hours of sparring had prepared him for legendary battles. What Freddie was sharing went beyond professional frustrations or concerns about future fights. It was something much more personal, much more human. The veteran trainer was opening up about the toll that decades of high-pressure situations had taken on him, about sleepless nights spent analyzing opponents and strategizing for fights that could make or break careers. He spoke about the weight of responsibility he felt every time he guided a fighter into battle, knowing that his decisions in those crucial moments could determine not just victory or defeat, but the long-term health and future of the athletes he cared about. Manny could hear the exhaustion seeping through every word. Freddie described moments when the magnitude of his role became overwhelming, when the pressure of being responsible for the tactical success of world-class fighters felt like carrying a mountain on his shoulders. He talked about waking up in the middle of the night, his mind racing with combinations and counter-strategies, unable to find peace even in sleep. The conversation revealed something that Manny had never fully understood before: the emotional cost of being in Freddie's position. While fighters received the glory and recognition for their victories, trainers like Freddie carried the burden of every decision, every adjustment, every moment of doubt that occurred in preparation for and during fights. They absorbed the stress of their fighters' careers as if it were their own, often without receiving the same level of support or recognition for their sacrifices. As Manny continued to pace the gym, he began to see his own career through a different lens. Every training session, every strategic adjustment, every moment when Freddie had pushed him beyond his comfort zone had come at a personal cost to the man who had believed in him from the beginning. The realization hit him with surprising force. While he had been focused on his own journey, his own challenges and triumphs, Freddie had been quietly carrying the emotional weight of both their dreams. The gym's overhead lights flickered slightly, casting shifting shadows that seemed to mirror the complexity of emotions Manny was experiencing. He thought about all the times Freddie had been there for him, during devastating defeats when motivation seemed impossible to find, during moments of self-doubt when the path forward was unclear, during the pressure-filled weeks leading up to the biggest fights of his career. Now, for the first time, their roles seemed to be reversing. Manny stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the center of the ring. The silence on his end of the phone call wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, with recognition, and with the beginning of a deep appreciation for sacrifices he had never fully acknowledged. He realized that this moment wasn't just about receiving difficult news. It was about discovering the true depth of a relationship that had shaped both their lives in ways neither had ever fully expressed. The phone call seemed to stretch through time, each minute feeling like an hour as Manny absorbed the full weight of what Freddie was sharing with him. The trainer's vulnerability was something entirely new in their relationship, and it forced Manny to confront aspects of their partnership that he had never considered before. As he listened, memories began flooding back, not the triumphant moments that usually dominated his recollections, but the quieter, more subtle instances when Freddie's dedication had gone far beyond what any contract or professional obligation required. Manny remembered the early morning sessions when Freddie would arrive at the gym before dawn, already having spent hours studying footage of upcoming opponents. There had been countless times when the trainer would stay late into the evening, long after other fighters had gone home, working one-on-one with Manny to perfect techniques that would prove crucial in upcoming battles. These weren't just professional responsibilities. They were acts of personal investment that had shaped the trajectory of Manny's entire career. The weight of this realization settled heavily in Manny's chest as he continued to listen. Freddie was describing the physical toll that years of intense focus had taken on his body. But more importantly, he was opening up about the emotional exhaustion that came from constantly carrying the hopes and dreams of others. Every fighter who walked into his gym brought their own story, their own struggles, their own desperate need for success, and Freddie had absorbed all of these burdens as if they were his own. Manny found himself thinking about the moments after his most difficult losses, when Freddie had somehow found the strength to provide encouragement and strategic analysis, even when his own disappointment must have been crushing. The trainer had never shown weakness in those moments, never allowed his own emotions to overshadow what his fighters needed to hear. But now, through this phone call, Manny was beginning to understand the price Freddie had paid for that unwavering strength. The conversation took on an even more personal tone as Freddie began sharing details about sleepless nights spent worrying about the long-term health of fighters under his care. He talked about the constant balance between pushing athletes to achieve their maximum potential while ensuring they didn't suffer permanent damage in pursuit of glory. It was a responsibility that few people outside the boxing world could truly comprehend. The knowledge that every training decision, every strategic choice made during a fight, could have lasting consequences for someone's physical and mental well-being. Manny sat down on a bench near the ring, his legs suddenly feeling weak as the full scope of Freddie's emotional burden became clear. The trainer was describing moments of doubt that had plagued him throughout their partnership, times when he questioned whether his advice was correct, whether his strategies were putting fighters at unnecessary risk, whether the pursuit of championship belts was worth the potential cost to human lives and futures. What struck Manny most profoundly was the realization that Freddie had been carrying these concerns alone. The boxing world celebrated trainers for their victories, but rarely acknowledged the psychological pressure they faced or provided support systems for their emotional well-being. They were expected to be pillars of strength, tactical geniuses, and emotional anchors all at once, without showing any signs of the strain such responsibilities inevitably created. As the conversation continued, Manny began to understand that this phone call wasn't just about Freddie reaching a breaking point. It was about years of accumulated stress finally finding its voice. The trainer was sharing fears about his own future, concerns about whether he still had the mental and emotional capacity to guide fighters through the intense pressures of professional boxing. He was questioning his ability to continue carrying the weight of others' dreams when his own strength felt depleted. The gym around Manny seemed to grow quieter, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the gravity of this moment. He realized that their relationship was about to transform in ways neither of them had anticipated. The silence that followed Freddie's most vulnerable admission felt like a chasm between two continents. Manny could hear his own heartbeat echoing in his ears as he processed the magnitude of what his trainer had just revealed. For the first time in their long partnership, the roles had completely reversed. Freddie, the man who had always provided strength and guidance, was now the one in desperate need of support and understanding. Manny's mind raced through decades of shared experiences, but now every memory was filtered through this new understanding of Freddie's hidden struggles. He thought about the times when Freddie had seemed distracted during training sessions, moments that Manny had attributed to tactical concentration, but now realized might have been signs of the emotional exhaustion his trainer was describing. There had been subtle changes in Freddie's demeanor over the past year, a weariness in his eyes, a slight hesitation in his usually confident instructions, moments when he seemed to be carrying invisible weight. The phone felt heavy in Manny's hand as he absorbed the full impact of Freddie's confession. His trainer was describing a crisis of confidence that went beyond any single fight or training camp. It was a fundamental questioning of his purpose, his effectiveness, and his ability to continue in a profession that had defined his identity for most of his adult life. The man who had spent countless hours building up fighters' mental fortitude was now facing his own psychological battle. Manny found himself walking toward the heavy bag that had been central to so many of their training sessions. His bare feet moved silently across the canvas as he approached the worn leather, its surface scarred from thousands of punches thrown under Freddie's watchful eye. He placed his hand gently against the bag, feeling the familiar texture that represented countless hours of preparation, improvement, and shared dedication to the craft of boxing. What made this moment even more poignant was Manny's growing awareness of how rarely Freddie had been asked about his own well-being throughout their partnership. The boxing world was structured around the fighters, their needs, their goals, their physical and mental preparation. Trainers were expected to be selfless facilitators of others' dreams, their own emotional needs, often overlooked or considered secondary to the success of their athletes. Freddie was describing the weight of legacy, not just his own professional reputation, but his responsibility for the long-term welfare of every fighter he had trained. He carried the knowledge that his decisions had shaped careers, influenced life trajectories, and in some cases, determined whether fighters would be able to support their families for generations to come. The pressure of such responsibility had accumulated over decades, creating a burden that no single person should have to carry alone. Manny began to understand that this phone call represented more than just a moment of crisis. It was a turning point that would define the future of their relationship and possibly Freddie's entire career. The trainer was reaching out not just for emotional support, but for validation, that his years of dedication had been meaningful, that his sacrifices had been worthwhile, and that his contributions to the sport would be remembered beyond the championship belts and victory celebrations. The evening had completely settled into darkness outside the gym, but inside, Illuminated by the overhead lights, Manny stood facing one of the most important decisions of his life. How he responded to Freddie's vulnerability would determine not just the future of their professional partnership, but whether a man who had given everything to the sport of boxing would find the strength to continue his journey. The realization hit Manny with the force of a perfectly timed uppercut. Throughout his entire professional career, he had been so focused on his own journey, his own challenges and triumphs, that he had never truly considered the emotional toll his success and failures had taken on the man who had guided him through it all. Standing alone in the dimly lit gym, phone pressed against his ear, Manny felt a profound shift in his understanding of what it meant to be truly connected to another person's life and dreams. Freddie's words continued to pour out, each sentence revealing another layer of the complex emotional landscape he had been navigating in silence. He spoke about the pressure of public expectations, how every training decision was scrutinized by media and fans who had no understanding of the intricate psychological and physical factors that went into preparing a world-class fighter. The trainer described feeling like he was performing on a stage where every mistake was magnified, every success was credited primarily to the fighter, and every failure was blamed squarely on his shoulders. Manny closed his eyes and allowed himself to truly listen, not just to the words being spoken, but to the emotion beneath them. This was a man who had dedicated his life to perfecting the art and science of boxing training, who had studied opponents with the intensity of a scholar, who had sacrificed personal relationships and his own physical well-being to ensure that fighters under his care had every possible advantage. Now, that same dedication was threatening to consume him. The conversation took on an even more personal dimension as Freddie began sharing his fears about aging and relevance in a sport that constantly demanded innovation and adaptation. He talked about younger trainers entering the field with fresh perspectives and new methodologies, and how he sometimes questioned whether his traditional approaches were still effective in the modern boxing landscape. The industry that had once embraced his expertise now sometimes made him feel like a relic from a different era. Manny found himself reflecting on his own relationship with aging and evolution in boxing. As a fighter, he had faced questions about when to retire, when his skills might begin to diminish, when the risks would outweigh the rewards. But he had never considered that trainers faced similar pressures, similar doubts about their continuing effectiveness and place in the sport. Freddie was describing a professional identity crisis that paralleled many of the same concerns fighters experienced, but with the added burden of being responsible for others, careers, and well-being. What made this moment even more significant was Manny's growing understanding of how isolated Freddie had become in his struggles. The boxing community provided extensive support systems for fighters, medical teams, nutritionists, sports psychologists, management teams, but trainers, especially veteran trainers like Freddie, were often expected to be self-sufficient, to handle their own emotional and psychological needs, while focusing entirely on their athletes' requirements. Freddie's voice carried a tremor as he described recent nights when sleep had become impossible, when his mind raced through scenarios and possibilities until exhaustion overcame him just hours before he needed to be alert and focused for training sessions. He talked about the weight of carrying secrets, knowing fighters' vulnerabilities, understanding their fears and insecurities, being trusted with information that could never be shared, but added to his own psychological burden. Manny realized that this phone call was more than just a moment of crisis. It was an act of incredible trust and vulnerability. Freddie was choosing to share his deepest professional and personal struggles with someone whose career he had helped shape, risking the fundamental dynamic of their relationship for the possibility of understanding and support. The weight of Freddie's revelation settled into Manny's consciousness, like sediment in still water, each layer adding depth to his understanding of their shared history. As the phone call continued, Manny began to piece together a mosaic of moments that had previously seemed insignificant, but now revealed themselves as signs of the burden his trainer had been carrying. The slight tremor in Freddie's hands during recent training sessions, the way he had begun double-checking strategies that he once executed with unwavering confidence, the moments when his usually sharp focus would drift to some distant concern. Standing in the center of the ring where they had spent countless hours perfecting combinations and strategies, Manny felt the profound responsibility of this moment. Freddie wasn't just sharing his struggles, he was entrusting Manny with the most vulnerable parts of his professional and personal identity, This wasn't a conversation between trainer and fighter anymore. It was a deeply human exchange between two men whose lives had become inextricably intertwined through years of shared dreams, defeats, and victories. Freddie's voice carried the weight of accumulated disappointments as he described recent training camps, where his usual enthusiasm had been replaced by a grinding sense of obligation. He talked about mornings when getting out of bed felt like preparing for battle, when the thought of entering the gym filled him with anxiety rather than excitement. The passion that had once driven him to study hours of fight footage and develop innovative training techniques had been slowly eroded by years of relentless pressure and responsibility. Manny found himself remembering specific instances when Freddie had seemed different, moments that now made perfect sense in light of what he was hearing. There had been times during press conferences when Freddie's responses seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous, when his trademark confidence appeared to be carefully constructed rather than naturally flowing. The trainer had been performing strength and certainty while privately battling doubt and exhaustion. The conversation revealed the depth of Freddie's investment in every fighter he had ever trained. He wasn't just describing professional responsibilities, he was talking about sleepless nights spent worrying about fighters' futures, about the weight of knowing that his decisions could influence not just careers, but entire family legacies. Every victory celebration was shadowed by concerns about the fighter's next challenge. Every defeat was followed by intense self-analysis and guilt about whether different training approaches might have changed the outcome. Manny realized that Freddie had been carrying the emotional weight of dozens of boxing careers simultaneously, absorbing the stress and pressure of each fighter's journey as if it were his own. The trainer had become a repository for hopes, fears, and dreams that belonged to others, never finding adequate outlets for the psychological burden such responsibility created. He had been expected to be strong enough to support everyone else, while having no one to support him in return. As the minutes passed, Manny began to understand that this phone call represented a critical juncture not just for Freddie, but for his own evolution as both a fighter and a human being. The conversation was forcing him to confront the selfish aspects of his relationship with his trainer, the way he had accepted Freddie's dedication and sacrifice without fully appreciating the personal cost. He had benefited enormously from Freddie's expertise and commitment, but had never considered what he might offer in return beyond professional success. Freddie's words painted a picture of isolation that was both heartbreaking and eye-opening. Despite being surrounded by fighters, media, and boxing industry professionals, he had been fundamentally alone with his deepest concerns and fears. The very nature of his role as trainer had created a barrier between him and others. He was supposed to be the source of strength and wisdom, not someone who needed support and understanding. The gym around Manny seemed to pulse with the energy of all the moments they had shared in that space, but now every memory was infused with new meaning and understanding. The transformation happening within Manny during that phone call was as profound as any technical adjustment Freddie had ever helped him make in the ring. For the first time in their partnership, Manny found himself thinking not about his own needs, concerns, or career trajectory, but about how he could provide the same kind of unwavering support that Freddie had given him for so many years. The shift felt both natural and revolutionary, a fundamental reimagining of their relationship that went far beyond the traditional boundaries of trainer and fighter. As Freddie continued to share his struggles, Manny began formulating not just an emotional response, but a concrete plan of action. He realized that words alone, no matter how heartfelt or supportive, would not be sufficient to address the depth of exhaustion and doubt his trainer was experiencing. This situation required something more substantial, more tangible, a demonstration of loyalty and gratitude that could match the years of dedication Freddie had invested in their partnership. Manny's mind raced through possibilities as he considered the resources and influence at his disposal. His success in boxing had provided him with financial stability, social connections, and a platform that could be leveraged to create meaningful change. For the first time, he began to see these advantages not as personal achievements, but as tools that could be used to support others, particularly the man who had been instrumental in making those achievements possible. The conversation was revealing layers of the boxing industry that Manny had never fully considered. Freddie was describing a systematic problem where trainers, despite being essential to the sport's success, often lacked adequate support systems, retirement planning, or recognition for their contributions. They were expected to pour everything into their fighters' careers, while their own long-term security and well-being remained uncertain. The industry celebrated trainers during moments of triumph, but provided little safety net during times of struggle or transition. Manny found himself thinking about other trainers he had known throughout his career, dedicated professionals who had given their lives to the sport, but might be facing similar challenges in silence. Freddie's vulnerability was opening his eyes to a broader issue that affected an entire community of people who had shaped the careers of countless fighters, but rarely received adequate appreciation or support for their sacrifices. The phone call was also forcing Manny to confront his own evolution as a person and public figure. His boxing career had always been primarily about personal achievement, family security, and representing his country with pride. But this moment was presenting an opportunity for a different kind of legacy, one based on using his success to address problems that existed within the sport he loved, particularly for the people who worked behind the scenes to make champions possible. Freddie's voice was becoming increasingly strained as he described the physical manifestations of his emotional exhaustion. He talked about headaches that appeared during training sessions, the way his heart would race when making strategic decisions that once came naturally, and the constant feeling of operating under a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. These weren't just psychological symptoms, they were signs that years of accumulated stress were beginning to affect his physical health. The realization that Freddie might be facing serious health consequences because of his dedication to others created a sense of urgency in Manny's mind. This wasn't just about providing emotional support or professional advice. It was about potentially saving the life and career of a man who had given everything to the sport without considering the long-term cost to himself. As the conversation neared what felt like a natural conclusion, Manny understood that his response in the coming minutes would define not just their future relationship, but potentially Freddie's ability to continue in a profession that had shaped his entire adult identity. The silence that followed Freddie's final words felt like the moment before a bell rings to start the most important round of a fighter's career. Manny stood in the center of the ring, phone still pressed against his ear, knowing that what he said and did in the next few minutes would determine whether one of boxing's greatest trainers would find the strength to continue his journey or be lost to the exhaustion that threatened to consume him. Without hesitation, Manny made a decision that surprised even himself with its clarity and conviction. He began speaking with a tone that carried all the authority and confidence that Freddie had helped him develop over the years, but now directed toward supporting rather than competing. His words weren't just expressions of gratitude or sympathy. They were concrete commitments, specific plans, and actionable solutions that addressed every concern Freddie had shared during their conversation. Manny outlined a comprehensive support system that would begin immediately. He described financial arrangements that would ensure Freddie's long-term security, removing the economic pressures that had contributed to his trainer's exhaustion. More importantly, he proposed a restructuring of their professional relationship that would reduce Freddie's workload while maintaining his essential role in strategic planning and fighter development. The goal wasn't to diminish Freddie's contributions, but to create sustainable working conditions that prioritized his health and well-being. The plan extended beyond their personal partnership to address the broader issues affecting trainers throughout the boxing industry. Manny committed to establishing a foundation that would provide support services for veteran trainers, including healthcare, retirement planning, and mental health resources. Freddie's struggles had opened his eyes to a systematic problem that required systematic solutions, and Manny was determined to use his platform and resources to create meaningful change. As he continued speaking, Manny could hear a gradual shift in Freddie's breathing, a subtle relaxation that suggested his words were having the intended impact. The trainer wasn't just receiving promises of support, he was experiencing the profound relief that comes from knowing that someone truly understands the depth of his struggles and is committed to addressing them with concrete action rather than empty reassurances. Manny also addressed the emotional aspects of Freddie's crisis, acknowledging the courage it had taken to share his vulnerabilities and expressing how this conversation had fundamentally changed his understanding of their relationship. He described his intention to create regular opportunities for honest communication, ensuring that Freddie would never again have to carry such burdens in isolation. Their partnership would evolve from a traditional trainer-fighter dynamic to something more reciprocal and supportive. The conversation concluded with Manny making arrangements to travel immediately to meet with Freddie in person. This wasn't something that could be resolved through phone calls or written agreements. It required face-to-face interaction, shared planning, and the kind of personal attention that demonstrated genuine commitment to change. Manny was prepared to restructure his entire schedule and priorities to ensure that Freddie received the support he needed and deserved. As he finally ended the call, Manny remained standing in the ring for several minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The conversation had been about much more than addressing Freddie's immediate crisis. It had revealed the kind of person Manny wanted to become and the legacy he wanted to create beyond his boxing achievements. The phone call had transformed him from someone who primarily received support to someone who was ready to provide it, with the same intensity and dedication he had always brought to his training and fighting. The gym around him no longer felt like just a place where he had developed his boxing skills. It had become the setting for one of the most important conversations of his life, a space where he had discovered the true meaning of loyalty, gratitude, and human connection. Every piece of equipment, every corner of the ring, every inch of canvas now held memories not just of physical preparation, but of emotional growth and personal transformation. Manny walked slowly toward the exit, already mentally preparing for the journey ahead, not to another fight or training camp, but to support a man who had given everything to help him achieve his dreams and now needed someone to believe in his worth and value in return. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.